She walked into his office with a folder full of evidence that could destroy him, and found him sitting in the dark, holding a photograph, crying. Not the tears of a man who had lost money. The tears of a man who had lost everything that ever mattered before the money existed. Sophia Bennett stood frozen in the doorway, her heart slamming against her ribs, every instinct screaming at her to run. Then, Adrian Valenti looked up, and the most feared man in Chicago asked her in a voice barely above a whisper, "You think I'm a monster?" If you're just joining us, subscribe to this channel right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The assignment came on a Tuesday morning, delivered, the way bad news always arrived in Sophia Bennett's life, quietly wrapped in professional language, with a smile that didn't reach anyone's eyes. Her supervisor at the Financial Crimes Division, a tall, carefully groomed man named Director Harlan Webb, set a manila folder on the edge of her desk without sitting down. That was always the signal. When Harlan sat, the conversation was routine. When he stood, the conversation was the kind you didn't repeat to anyone. "Valenti Group," he said simply. Sophia looked up from her monitor. She had been cross-referencing shell company registrations for an entirely different case, something involving a pharmaceutical distributor in suburban Cleveland. Small, manageable. The kind of case that ended with a settlement and nobody going to prison. She had spent 3 years at the Federal Financial Crimes Division, building a reputation as someone who was methodical, patient, and exceptionally good at finding the numbers that other people buried. She was not known for being reckless. She was not known for volunteering for impossible assignments. She was definitely not known for being the kind of person who walked willingly into the orbit of Adrian Valenti. "You're serious," she said. "I'm always serious." She pulled the folder toward her and opened it. The first page was a photograph Adrian Valenti stepping out of a black vehicle in front of his downtown Chicago office building. 2 men flanking him. Both of them built like refrigerators in expensive suits. Adrian himself was dressed simply. Dark jacket, dark shirt, no tie. He was 41 years old in the photograph, but looked younger in a way that seemed almost deliberately unfair. The kind of face that made you want to trust it before your brain caught up with your instincts. She'd seen his file before years ago when she was newer and still reading old cases for context. Valenti Group had been investigated no fewer than 7 times by 3 different federal agencies over the past 15 years. Not one of those investigations had resulted in a prosecution. Not one witness had ever held firm. Not one piece of paper had ever made it intact from subpoena to courtroom. 7 investigations, 0 convictions. One name that made grown men lower their voices when they said it. "What makes this time different?" Sophia asked. Harlan reached over and turned to the 3rd page of the folder. A single financial document, a wire transfer record, partially redacted. "We have an informant inside the organization. Someone who has been systematically copying internal financial records for the past 8 months. The data suggests that Valenti's CFO has been running a parallel ledger real revenue buried inside a network of 46 shell companies spread across 7 countries. Sophia studied the page. Even from the fragment she was looking at, the architecture was sophisticated. Whoever designed this system understood forensic accounting. They understood the exact audit thresholds that triggered automatic review. They had built something that looked at first pass completely legitimate. "This is good work," she said, and she meant it as an observation, not a compliment. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. "Yes," Harlan said. "Which is why we need you." She looked up at him. "You're the best we have at pattern recognition inside complex corporate structures," he said, and there was no flattery in his voice. He was stating a fact the same way he would state that water was wet. "We need someone who can map the full network before Valenti's team realizes the informant has been compromised. We believe they may already suspect something, which means we have a narrow window." "How narrow?" 3 weeks, maybe less." Sophia closed the folder. She thought about the pharmaceutical distributor in Cleveland, about the perfectly manageable case waiting on her monitor, about the fact that she had never once in her professional career done anything that made her feel genuinely afraid. "I want full access," she said. "Not filtered access. Not what your team decides I should see. Everything. Within reason. Everything, she said again. Or you find someone else, and we both know you won't find someone better. Harlan looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded once and walked away. She opened the folder again and looked at the photograph of Adrian Valenti. I was looking slightly to the left of the camera, not at it. His expression was unreadable in the way that was almost certainly practiced. The face of a man who had learned very early that readable expressions were liabilities. She had 3 weeks. She started reading. By the end of the first week, Sophia understood 3 things she hadn't understood before. The first was that Valenti Group was genuinely substantially profitable as a legitimate business. The construction division alone generated revenues that most publicly traded companies would consider enviable. The real estate holdings were managed conservatively, with an attention to long-term value over short-term extraction that was almost unusual for a private entity. On paper, without the parallel ledger, Valenti Group looked like a model of quiet, disciplined corporate wealth. The second thing she understood was that the parallel ledger was not the most sophisticated aspect of the concealment. The most sophisticated aspect was how the 2 systems, the legitimate and the hidden, were calibrated to reinforce each other's plausibility. One system made the other look real. It was the kind of design that required not just technical knowledge, but genuine strategic intelligence. The third thing she understood was that someone inside the organization was not just copying records, they were selecting them. Every document the informant had forwarded was chosen to illuminate the parallel structure without triggering the kind of attention that would get the informant discovered. Whoever they were careful in a way that went beyond survival instinct. They were building a case. Slowly, deliberately, which meant either the informant had a very specific objective or someone had coached them extremely well. She requested the informant file. Harlan told her it was above her clearance level. She told Harlan that if she couldn't profile the informant, she couldn't validate the documents, and if she couldn't validate the documents, there was no case. Harlan told her she'd receive what was available. What arrived the next morning was 9 lines of redacted text and a case reference number. 9 lines. She stared at them for a long moment. Then she set them aside and went back to the financial records because the money would tell her what the 9 lines wouldn't. The first time she saw Adrian Valenti in person, it was not in his office. It was in a hospital corridor on a Thursday afternoon, and she almost didn't recognize him because he wasn't wearing a suit. Dark jeans. A plain gray sweater. He was standing against a wall outside a room in the pediatric oncology wing, and he was talking to a woman. Sophia didn't recognize a woman who was clearly exhausted, clearly frightened, clearly running on the specific kind of adrenaline that parents of sick children run on when they have nothing left but forward momentum. Sophia had been in this building for entirely different reasons. One of the shell companies in the parallel network listed a medical equipment supplier as a vendor, and that supplier's registered address was 2 blocks from the hospital. She'd been on her way back from a records search. She'd taken a wrong elevator. She stopped when she saw him. I wasn't looking in her direction. He was looking at the woman he was speaking to, and whatever he was saying, she was listening with the particular attention of someone receiving information they hadn't expected and weren't sure they deserved. Then the woman said something, and Adrian reached into his jacket, and for one irrational second, Sophia felt every muscle in her body go rigid. He pulled out a business card and a pen. He wrote something on the back of the card and handed it to the woman. He said something else, short 2 or 3 words, and then he turned and walked toward the elevator without looking back. He passed within 12 feet of where Sophia was standing. He didn't look at her. She waited until he was in the elevator. Then she walked quickly to the corridor, where the woman was still standing, looking at the card in her hand. "Excuse me," Sophia said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I don't mean to intrude. I thought I recognized that man. Do you know who he was?" The woman looked up. She was in her mid-30s, wearing scrubs under an open jacket, and her eyes had the specific redness of someone who had been crying at intervals for several days. "He's a donor," she said. "For the children's wing. He comes sometimes." She looked back at the card. He wrote a number on the back. He said to call it if the insurance doesn't cover everything. She paused. He said not to worry about it. Sophia said nothing. Do you know him? The woman asked. Not yet, Sophia said. She processed what she'd seen for 2 days before she allowed herself to attach any meaning to it. Kindness as performance was a tool. Rich and powerful people understood the optics of charitable acts, and the more strategic among them deployed those acts with precision. A mafia boss who paid children's hospital bills was buying reputation community goodwill protection from the kind of neighborhood resentment that could generate inconvenient witnesses. It was not altruism. It was investment. She told herself this clearly and repeatedly. She also pulled the hospital's donor records through proper channels with the appropriate requests and discovered that Valenti Group had been making anonymous contributions to the pediatric oncology wing for 11 years. Not in Valenti's name. In a foundation name that traced back to a woman named Rosa Valenti deceased, whose records identified her as Adrian's younger sister. She had died 19 years ago. She'd been 12 years old. Sophia sat with that information for a long time. Then she wrote it into her notes without comment and kept working. She got into the building on a Friday evening 2 weeks into the assignment, using access credentials that the informant had provided and that Harlan's team had verified. The financial records she needed were in a server room on the 14th floor of Valenti Group's downtown headquarters, not digitally accessible from outside, which was why she had to be physically present to copy them. The building was not empty at 8 in the evening. She'd expected that. She'd planned for it. She knew which floors had security rotations, which elevators required keycard access, which stairwells didn't. What she hadn't planned for was the light under the door of the corner office on the 22nd floor, which was supposed to be unoccupied on Friday evenings because Adrian Valenti spent weekends at his residence in the North Shore suburbs. She'd verified his schedule through 3 independent sources. All 3 were apparently wrong. She registered the light under the door and made the decision she should not have made the decision that changed everything about what came after. She should have continued to the server room. She should have completed the extraction and left the building. She should have treated the light under the door as irrelevant information. Instead, she stopped. The floor was quiet. The door was slightly ajar, not fully latched, pushed almost closed, but not quite the way a door falls when the person inside doesn't bother to check whether it clicked. Through the gap, no sound, no conversation, no phone call, just silence and light. She told herself she was doing reconnaissance. She told herself that understanding his patterns, his physical presence in the space, was professionally relevant to the investigation. She told herself many things in the 6 seconds she stood in that corridor before she pushed the door open 2 inches further and looked. Howe was sitting at his desk, with the lights mostly off. The only illumination coming from a single lamp on the credenza behind him that threw his shadow large and dark across the wall. He wasn't on the phone. He wasn't on his computer. He was holding a photograph in both hands, leaning forward slightly with his elbows on the desk, and the expression on his face was something she had no word for. Immediately, something she would spend considerable time later trying to describe to herself accurately. It was grief. But it was old grief. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly anymore. The kind that you carry so long, it becomes simply part of the weight of being you. He was completely alone. And he was unmistakably quietly the way men who have never learned to do it properly do it. He was crying. She must have made a sound. A shift of weight, a breath something. Because he looked up, and for one frozen moment, the most feared man in Chicago was looking directly at her with his face completely open. All the armor down, every carefully constructed wall simply gone. Then it came back. All of it. She could see it happen in real time, the face reorganizing itself, the expression. Closing the stillness that must have taken years to perfect, settling over his features, like a mask clicking into place. He set the photograph face down on the desk. He looked at her. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, not yet. The tone of a man identifying a variable. Her mouth was dry. Her training, 3 years of federal financial investigation work, 2 years before that in forensic accounting, a graduate degree from Northwestern, that she'd worked nights to afford all of it, offered her approximately nothing useful in this exact moment. She had files on this man. She had case numbers, and wire transfer records, and shell company registration documents, and 9 redacted lines about an informant. None of that had prepared her for the reality of him in person, in a dark room, with his grief still visible at the edges of the mask. "My name is Sophia Bennett," she said, because lying about her name in this particular moment felt both pointless and dangerous. "I'm a federal investigative accountant." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Then very quietly he said, "You think I'm a monster." It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite an accusation. It was something stranger than both a man reading the expression on her face and naming what he found there, with the flat exhaustion of someone who has heard the answer to that question every day for 20 years and has stopped being surprised by it. Sophia thought about lying. She thought about the protocol-appropriate response, the professional deflection, the 6 different ways her training suggested she navigate unexpected personal disclosure during an investigation. She thought about all of it in the span of approximately 1.5 seconds. Then she said what was true. "I think monsters are the ones who stop caring that they hurt people." Adrian Valenti looked at her. The silence stretched. "Sit down," he said. "I don't think that's—" "Sit down, Ms. Bennett. I'm not going to hurt you." A pause, and something moved briefly through his expression that might in other circumstances have been almost wry. "You're in my building. You have a federal ID badge and presumably a service weapon. If I wanted to hurt you, you'd already know it." She sat. He didn't speak immediately. He reached over and turned the lamp slightly, so the light was less directed, less interrogation room, and more almost habitable. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the specific focus of a man who reads people for survival and has gotten exceptionally good at it. "How long have you been building your case?" he asked. She said nothing. 3 weeks, he said. "Maybe a little less. Harlan Webb's division." He watched her face. Not a question. "If you know about the investigation." "I know about most things," he said without particular pride. "I have people whose entire function is knowing about things before they become problems. You're not a problem, Ms. Bennett. You're a complication. There's a distinction." "What's the distinction?" "A problem is something you eliminate," he said. "A complication is something you solve." She studied him. "You said I'm not a problem." Not yet. Her heart was doing something irregular that she chose to categorize as adrenaline rather than fear, because fear was not useful and adrenaline at least had directionality. "You realize that if you're aware of the investigation, I have to report." "Report what you need to report," he said. "I'm not asking you to compromise your job." That stopped her. "Then what are you asking?" "Nothing yet." He was quiet for a moment. "Who is the informant?" "I don't have that information." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said slowly. "You don't. That's interesting." Something in the way he said it made her pay attention. Not to the words. To the thing underneath the words, the slight shift in his stillness, the way his attention focused inward for just a fraction of a second before coming back to her. Like a man who had just confirmed something he already suspected but had been hoping was wrong. "What are you thinking right now?" she asked. He looked at her with something that, against all reason and professional judgment, she could only identify as surprise. "Nobody asks me that," he said. "I'm asking." He was quiet for several seconds. Then, "I'm thinking that the person feeding you documents is not trying to help your investigation. I'm thinking they have a different objective, and I'm thinking that if you don't know who they are, you can't see what they're actually trying to accomplish." Sophia leaned forward slightly. "What are they actually trying to accomplish?" "Starting a war," Adrian said. "With my name on the wrong side of it." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. Those had been tense and territorial. This one was the silence of 2 people who had just realized they might be standing in the same place for completely different reasons. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He picked up the photograph from the desk, face down still, and he didn't turn it over and held it for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. "Because you answered my question honestly," he said. "And that doesn't happen very often." "What question?" He looked up at her. "Whether I was a monster." She held his gaze. I gave you a non-answer. No, he said quietly. You gave me the only answer that required you to actually think before you spoke. That's different. He set the photograph down again. Go do your job, Ms. Bennett. I won't stop you. But before you walk out of this building tonight, ask yourself who benefits most from what you're investigating and whether the answer is actually the federal government. She stood. Her legs were steady, which she noted with detached professional satisfaction. She walked to the door. She stopped. The photograph, she said without turning around. Who is it? The silence behind her was long enough that she didn't expect an answer. My sister, he said. She would have been 31 today. Sophia walked out of the office, down the corridor, into the stairwell, all the way down to the 14th floor and the server room she'd originally come to access. She copied the files she needed. She left the building. She got into her car. She drove 6 blocks before she pulled over and sat with her hands on the steering wheel for 3 full minutes. She thought about a woman in a hospital corridor holding a business card, crying with relief. She thought about a man sitting alone in a dark office, grieving someone who had been gone for 19 years on the anniversary of her birthday. She thought about Adrian Valenti telling her that someone inside his organization was trying to start a war and had chosen her investigation as the instrument. Then she thought about something that hadn't occurred to her until this exact moment, parked on a side street in the dark with the engine running. In the entire time they'd been speaking, Adrian Valenti had never once asked her to stop investigating. He'd told her to keep going. He'd told her to find the real answer. She pulled back into traffic. She had 6 folders of financial records to process. She had a case to build. She had an informant whose identity was classified above her clearance level. And she had, for the first time since she'd opened a manila folder on a Tuesday morning and seen a man's face looking away from a camera. A suspicion that the most dangerous thing about this assignment was not Adrian Valenti. It was whatever he already knew that she didn't. She drove back to the federal building, badged herself through security, and sat down at her desk at 9:47 on a Friday evening to start finding out. The records she had copied from the 14th floor server room loaded slowly. She sorted them by date, by entity, by transaction type. She cross-referenced them against the documents the informant had provided. She built a mapping grid, color-coded, multi-layered, the kind she used when the architecture was genuinely complex and required spatial visualization to see the full pattern. By midnight, she had found something the informant's documents had not shown her. A secondary network. Smaller. More carefully buried. Not parallel to the legitimate business, genuinely separate from it, with different counterparties, different transaction rhythms, different everything. The informant had provided records that illuminated the parallel ledger. This secondary network was not in any of those records, which meant the informant didn't know about it, or the informant knew about it and had deliberately left it out. She stared at the secondary network for a long time. Then she began to map where its transactions went. By 2 in the morning, she had a partial answer. The secondary network's money didn't flow to the places parallel. Ledger money typically went offshore accounts, real estate investment vehicles. It flowed into a series of accounts that she couldn't immediately identify because they were structured differently from anything else in the Valenti Group architecture. They looked almost like operational accounts, the kind used for ongoing regular expenses rather than wealth storage. She flagged them and kept going. By 3:30, she found a name attached to 2 of the accounts. Not a shell company name. An actual name. A name she recognized. She sat back in her chair and looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and stared at the screen without dialing anyone, because the person she needed to talk to was not on the list of people she was authorized to talk to, and the information she had just found was not something she could process through normal channels without understanding what it meant first. Adrian Valenti had told her someone inside his organization was trying to start a war. The name on these accounts was not inside his organization. The name on these accounts was inside hers. She was back at her desk by 7:30 the next morning, having slept 3 hours on the narrow couch in the break room and eaten a protein bar that tasted like cardboard dipped in artificial chocolate. She had printed nothing. She had sent nothing. She had copied the account information onto a notepad by hand and put the notepad in the inside pocket of her jacket against her chest, which was a thing she'd never done in 3 years of professional work, and which told her something meaningful about how seriously she was taking what she'd found. Her phone rang at 8:02. The number was blocked. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "You found the secondary network," said Adrian Valenti's voice. She stood up from her chair. Instinct. "How?" "Because you're good at your job, and you were in that building long enough," he said. "Don't say anything you don't want recorded. I'm not recording you, but the federal system you're calling from is almost certainly monitored." "I'm not on the federal system," she said. She was on her personal cell. She walked quickly toward the stairwell, away from her desk, away from the open-plan floor, where other people were beginning to arrive. "How did you get this number?" "I have people whose entire function is knowing things," he said, which was not new information. "The accounts," she said. "Yes." "The name?" "Yes." She pushed through the stairwell door and let it close behind her. "Tell me I'm wrong about what I think it means." A pause. "I can't tell you that." She put her back against the concrete wall and closed her eyes. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," he said, and something in his voice had a weight she hadn't heard there before. "Long enough that I should have done something about it before it became your problem." "This isn't just about the investigation, is it?" she said. Not a question. "No," he said. "It hasn't been about the investigation for quite some time. The investigation is the mechanism. The objective is different." "What's the objective?" The pause that followed was longer than any of the previous ones. "You," he said. She opened her eyes. "They needed an investigator who was good enough to find the parallel ledger," he said. "They needed someone credible. Someone clean, no prior connections to my organization, no reason to be compromised. Someone who would build a case that would hold up, that would give them what they actually needed." Another pause. "They picked you specifically, Ms. Bennett, 3 months ago, before you ever received that folder." The stairwell was very cold and very quiet. "Why?" she said. "Because," Adrian said, "once you build a strong enough case and it goes up the chain, it reaches someone who will make it disappear in exchange for something. And that something has nothing to do with prosecuting me." He paused. "You're not building a case against me. You're building leverage, and you have no idea for whom." She thought about Harlan Webb, about the way he'd stood rather than sat, about 9 lines of redacted text, about access credentials from an informant whose identity was classified above her clearance level. She thought about the name on the accounts in the secondary network. "I need to think," she said. "I know," he said. "Think fast. You have less time than you did yesterday." He disconnected. Sophia stood in the stairwell for 60 seconds. Then she walked back out onto the floor, sat down at her desk, and began with extraordinary care and precision to build a second investigation inside the first one. This time, she was building it for herself. The second investigation ran parallel to the first one, the way a shadow runs parallel to the body, casting its same shape, same direction, but made of entirely different material. Sophia kept her official work moving forward. She processed the financial records she'd copied from the Valenti Group server room. She filed interim reports with Harlan Webb's office. She attended the 2 weekly briefings her division required during active investigations and said exactly the right amount, enough to demonstrate progress, not enough to reveal the part of the picture she was building privately by hand. On paper, she kept in a locked drawer at her apartment rather than in any federal system. She had been doing this for 11 days when she understood something that should have frightened her and instead made her profoundly, almost dangerously calm. She trusted Adrian Valenti more than she trusted the agency she worked for. That realization arrived at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday while she was standing in her kitchen with a cup of coffee she hadn't yet drunk. Looking at the notepad on her counter, the one with the hand-copied account information and the name she still hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. She sat with the realization. She turned it over. She examined it from every angle she could reach, looking for the place where she'd made an error in judgment, where confirmation bias or situational manipulation had led her somewhere she shouldn't go. She couldn't find it. Adrian had called her twice more since that first morning. Both calls were brief. Both were on her personal cell-blocked number, not recorded by anyone as far as she could determine. He didn't ask her how the investigation was progressing. He didn't ask her what she'd found. He gave her information, small pieces precisely chosen, always verifiable, against things she already had access to. How was teaching her how to read the architecture she was inside without telling her what to see. That was the distinction, and it mattered. He wasn't directing her. He was giving her tools and trusting her to use them correctly. She drank her coffee. She went to work. She filed another interim report that was accurate in every particular it contained and missing everything that actually mattered. It was the most professionally dishonest thing she had ever done in her life, and the fact that she believed it was the right call told her exactly how far she'd traveled from the woman who had opened a manila folder 12 days ago. The third call from Adrian came on a Thursday afternoon. She was in a conference room alone, reviewing a new batch of documents her team had processed. She stepped into the hallway. "The informant has been identified," he said. No greeting. He never used greetings. Her chest tightened. "By your people. By someone else's people, which means the window you have is now measured in days, not weeks." She pressed her back against the hallway wall, keeping her voice very low. "Are they in danger?" A pause. "The informant." "Yes." Another pause, slightly longer. "Probably. Does that surprise you?" "No," she said. "It concerns me." "Concern is not action," he said. "I'm aware of that." She thought quickly. "If your people found them first, before whoever is moving against them, could you protect them?" The silence that followed was the kind that meant he was genuinely thinking rather than performing consideration. "That depends on who they are," he said. "I can't protect someone I don't know. I don't have the clearance to access the informant file." "I know. But someone does." "Yes," he said. "Someone does." She understood what he wasn't saying. "You want me to get it?" "I want you to decide what you want to do," he said. "I'm not asking you to compromise your clearance, Ms. Bennett. I'm telling you that a person may be in danger, and the people who are supposed to protect them have a different set of priorities." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "If I get the file, I need to bring it to you in person." "Yes. Tonight. If you can manage it." She managed it. The clearance workaround she used was technically legal, architecturally complex, and precisely the kind of thing she'd spent 3 years building the institutional credibility to be able to do without triggering an automatic review. She accessed the informant file through a back door in the case management system that existed for situations where field investigators needed information. Their official clearance level didn't cover a mechanism designed for emergencies, used, rarely logged, but not actively monitored. She read the file in 7 minutes. Then she closed it, cleared her access trail as best she could, and drove across town to a private address that Adrian had given her in a text message that deleted itself after 30 seconds, in a way that reminded her with uncomfortable clarity that the man operated in a world where that kind of technology was simply standard. He met her at the door himself. No security visible. Just him in that same dark sweater from the hospital, and behind him, a space that was clearly a working residence. Papers on a table, a half-empty coffee cup, the lived-in quality of a place where someone actually existed rather than performed existing. "The informant," she said without preamble, "is a woman named Diane Caruso, 44 years old. She has worked in the Valenti Group finance department for 9 years." Adrian went very still. Not the controlled stillness she'd seen in his office. A different kind. The sudden cessation of movement that happens when the body receives information the mind isn't ready to process. "Diane," he said. "You know her. She's been with the company since before I restructured the finance division." He said it carefully, the way you say something when you're simultaneously confirming and absorbing it. "Her husband was one of my people. He died 4 years ago. Heart attack. 41 years old." Sophia said nothing. "I paid for her kids' school," he said. "Both of them. The younger one just started high school." He looked at her. "Why is she doing this?" "The file doesn't have a motive narrative," Sophia said. "But the handler notes suggest she was approached approximately 14 months ago. Someone made contact. offered her money initially, then shifted to using something else as leverage. What leverage? Sophia held his gaze. Her younger son. Someone has information about him. What specifically I couldn't determine from the file. But whatever it is, it's enough to keep a woman who has every reason to be loyal doing something she clearly doesn't want to do. Adrian sat down. She had never seen him sit like that. Not the deliberate, controlled way he'd sat in his office when they first met. This was different. This was a man whose legs had simply decided they were done holding him up for the moment. "She's not a traitor," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Sophia said. "I don't think she is. She's a mother trying to protect her child." "Yes." He put one hand over his mouth and stared at the table. 14 months, he said. "She's been living with this for 14 months. His voice was even, but underneath the evenness, there was something that required considerable effort to hold in place. And she came to work every day, and she sat across from people she'd known for years, and she did what they made her do because there was nothing else she could do. Adrian. She used his first name without deciding to. It just came out, and she didn't walk it back. She's going to be identified within days, possibly sooner. What happens to her when that happens depends on who finds her first. He looked up. "Can you get her out?" Sophia said. "Her and her son, both of them. Before whoever is moving against you reaches her." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she was getting better at reading the exact moment when Adrian Valenti, crime lord immovable force, the man whose name made people lower their voices, stepped aside and led a different older version of him briefly forward. The one that existed before the world had shaped him into something impenetrable. "Yes," he said. "I can get her out." "Then we don't have time for this conversation to last much longer." I was already reaching for his phone. She turned to leave. His voice stopped her at the door. "Ms. Bennett." She turned back. "You just broke approximately 4 federal regulations to get that file," he said. "I'm aware. That's not a small thing. Once you do something like that, there's no—" "I know," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I've been aware of that since Wednesday morning." She held his gaze. "Some things matter more than the regulations designed to govern them." He looked at her for a moment that was a beat too long to be professional, and both of them knew it. "Go home," he said. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be complicated." Was today not complicated? Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. It was the first time she'd seen anything like it, and it changed the architecture of his expression, entirely made him look younger, and tired, and almost impossibly human. "Today was simple," he said. "Today was just one person trying to help another person. Tomorrow is where things get difficult." She drove home. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about a woman named Diane Caruso working in a finance office for 9 years, going home to her children, living with a secret that was eating her alive, while the man she was betraying secretly paid her younger son's tuition. She thought about a world where the people who were supposed to be the good guys were using a frightened mother as a tool, and the supposed monster was the one trying to get her to safety. By 3 in the morning, she stopped trying to fit any of this into the framework she'd brought to it 12 days ago because the framework had ceased to be useful. She built a new one. It was less comfortable. It didn't offer clean narratives or satisfying categorizations. It offered only the obligation to deal with what was actually true rather than what was supposed to be. She was better at that than she'd previously known. She went to sleep at 3:45. At 4:58 her phone rang. Unknown number. Not Adrian's blocked number. Unknown. She answered. "Ms. Bennett," said a voice she didn't recognize. Male measured with the specific kind of calm that was either professional training or genuine absence of feeling, she couldn't tell which. "You've been busy." "Who is this?" "Someone who has been watching your investigation with considerable interest," the voice said. "You've been doing excellent work, truly. Better than we expected, honestly. Most people would have stayed inside the boundaries they were given." She sat up in bed. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something before you make any more decisions that can't be undone," the voice said. "You are operating under a misapprehension about what you're involved in." You believe this is a criminal investigation that has been compromised by someone inside your agency. That's not accurate. Tell me what's accurate. This is a controlled operation, the voice said. Every element of it, the informant, the documents, the investigation parameters, the timeline, all of it was constructed to achieve a specific outcome. You were chosen because your work is unimpeachable. A case you build has credibility that a case built by most of your colleagues simply doesn't. We needed that credibility. She felt something cold move through her, slow and comprehensive. Who is we? That's not information you need. What's the specific outcome you're after? A pause. Leverage, the voice said. Not over Valenti. Valenti is the mechanism, not the objective. The objective is a man who has spent the past decade making himself untouchable by building the right relationships with the right agencies. Another pause. Your investigation creates documentation. That documentation creates pressure. That pressure creates a conversation that otherwise couldn't happen. She understood. The entirety of it all at once, like a picture that required looking at from a specific angle before the image resolved. You're not after Valenti at all, she said. Mr. Valenti is a very useful piece of scenery, the voice agreed pleasantly. And Diane Caruso, a silence, shorter than the others. Mrs. Caruso has been compensated for her participation. She's been coerced, Sophia said, and there was nothing professional or measured in her voice. She's been threatened through her child, and you're calling that compensation. I'd encourage you not to allow emotion to complicate your thinking at this stage, Ms. Bennett. I'd encourage you, she said, to tell me what you want from this phone call, because I'm about 4 seconds from hanging up and doing something you won't enjoy. Another pause. When the voice came back, the pleasantness was still there, but it had thinned. We want you to continue the investigation. We want you to complete the case documentation. We want it delivered through official channels within the next 5 days. And if I don't, then we use the access log from the case management system you entered at 10:47 this evening, the voice said. Unauthorized clearance access to a classified informant file. Federal charges. Career termination. Possible imprisonment. A beat. We are not, Ms. Bennett, the kind of people who need you to cooperate. We are the kind of people who would prefer that you do. She sat in the dark with the phone against her ear. I need 24 hours to think, she said. You have 12. The call ended. She sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she got out of bed, got dressed, and drove back across the city, because she had 12 hours and no intention of spending any of them thinking. Adrian answered the door before she knocked. She didn't ask how he knew she was there. She had stopped asking that kind of question. I got a call, she said. I know, I expected they would. He stepped back to let her in. Sit down. I don't want to sit down. Sophia. First name. Something shifted in the room's temperature. Sit down. She sat. He sat across from her, and there was something different in how he held himself. Now, a directness that was not the controlled performance of authority she'd seen in his office on the first night. Something more straightforward than that. More honest. They called to assess whether you were still controllable, he said. Which means they're concerned. Should they be? That depends on what you decide. He leaned forward slightly. They need your case to be credible. If you complete it, you give them what they want, and they walk away, and you spend the rest of your career knowing you were used. If you refuse, they use the access log, and your career is over, and possibly your freedom. Those aren't the only two options. He looked at her. There's a third, she said. I complete the case, but I build it correctly. I build the case that's actually there, the one that documents what they're doing, not the one they want me to build. I use the same documents, the same financial records, the same everything, and I write a case that points at the right target. The silence that followed was absolute. If you do that, he said carefully, you're not building a case against a mafia organization. You're building a case against people who have the resources and the institutional access to make that case disappear and make you disappear along with it. Yes, she said. So I'd need to make sure the case goes somewhere they can't reach before they know what I've done. He studied her for a long moment. She could see him thinking not the rapid social calculation she imagined from someone in his position, but something slower and more serious. "You'd be burning your career either way," he said. "My career was burned the moment someone decided I was a useful tool," she said. "I'd rather burn it doing something that matters." "This is not a small thing." "You said that already. I'm saying it again because I need you to hear it." He leaned forward until she was fully in his attention. All of it, the complete and undivided focus of a man who'd learned to be completely present because distraction was dangerous. Once you file a case like that, there is no walking it back. "No, I made a mistake, I misunderstood." You are declaring formally and publicly, and on the record, that a federal operation was used for criminal leverage by people inside the federal system. That makes you a target for the rest of the time those people are free. I know. And you're still sitting here. "I'm still sitting here," she said. He sat back. He was quiet for a moment. Then something settled in his expression, not quite acceptance, something older than that. Resolution. The face of a man who has thought about something long enough that the decision stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the only road that was ever actually available. "I have people," he said. "Not the kind you're thinking of. I have lawyers, forensic accountants, compliance architects, people who work in the legitimate structure of the organization and who are very good at making documents mean what they actually mean rather than what someone wants them to mean. You want to help me build the case. I want to give you the full picture," he said, "not a fragment designed to point you in the wrong direction. Everything, the parallel structure, the secondary network, the money flows, all of it. With my people helping you understand what it actually shows." He held her gaze. "You build the real case. I give you what you need to build it correctly. And then we figure out together how to get it somewhere it can't be buried." She looked at him. She thought about everything she'd believed about this man 3 weeks ago. The manila folder, the case numbers, the file that called him a ruthless crime boss, the 7 investigations, the 0 convictions. She thought about what those files didn't contain. The hospital corridor, the children's tuition, the photograph of a sister who had been 12 years old. "You've been trying to clean this up yourself," she said quietly. "For years. The restructuring, the legitimate revenue, the compliance architecture. You've been trying to get out from under this." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was even and careful. "It is very difficult to unwind a structure that was built over 2 decades, he said. "There are people who depend on it, people whose livelihoods are inside it. And there are people who don't want it unwound because they benefit from it staying exactly as it is. The same people who are using my investigation." Yes, she absorbed that. "They're not trying to expose you. They're trying to keep you locked in place, because a Valenti group that goes legitimate is a Valenti group that stops being useful to them." Something crossed his face, not surprise because he clearly already knew this, but something that looked like relief. The specific relief of having something you've known alone for a long time finally said aloud by another person. "Nobody had ever said it that plainly before," he said. "Is it wrong?" "No," he said. "It's entirely right." A pause. "Which makes you, Ms. Bennett, extraordinarily inconvenient to a very specific group of people." "Sophia," she said. He looked at her. "You've been calling me Ms. Bennett for 2 weeks, she said. "You can use my name." The almost smile again. Tired and real, and nothing like the controlled absence of expression she'd first seen on his face. "Sophia," he said, "we should get to work." They worked through the rest of the night and into the early morning, sitting across from each other at the table in his kitchen, with documents spread between them, and 2 people who had started on opposite sides of something, finding hour by hour that the distance between those sides was smaller than either of them had calculated. He knew the architecture of the parallel system in a way no financial record could convey. He knew the logic of it, the decisions behind each structural choice, the places where legitimate and illegitimate had been deliberately blurred, and the reasons why. He gave her that knowledge without hedging, without reservation, without asking her to protect anything. He told her what was there, and what it meant, and where it pointed. She took that knowledge and built with it, because what she did was construct narratives from numbers, and the narrative she was constructing was the most important thing she had ever built. Somewhere around 5 in the morning, with gray light coming in around the edges of the room, she looked up from a document she'd been annotating and found him looking at her. Not studying her, not calculating, just looking the way someone looks at a thing they haven't decided what to do with yet. "What?" she said. "You told me once that a painful past explains actions without excusing them," he said. She remembered. His office the first night, the words coming out of her mouth before she'd thought them through. "I stand by it." "So do I," he said. "I'm not asking you to excuse anything." A pause. "I'm asking whether explanation has any value to you, whether knowing why someone made the choices they made changes anything." She set down her pen. She thought about it honestly, not about what the answer was supposed to be, but about what was actually true for her. "Yes," she said finally. "It changes what I think is possible going forward. Not what happened, not whether it was wrong, but whether the person is still the same person who made those choices, or whether they've moved." He nodded slowly. "That's a more precise distinction than most people make." "What does your past explain?" she said. I was quiet for a moment, not evasive thinking. "It explains why I confused control with protection for a very long time," he said. "Why I believed that the only way to keep people safe was to make sure nothing could get close enough to hurt them, including people." A pause. "Including the people I was supposedly protecting. And now I'm sitting in my kitchen at 5 in the morning, helping a federal investigative accountant build a case that will likely result in significant professional and personal consequences for me," he said with a dryness that was not quite humor and not quite resignation. "So perhaps my framework has shifted." She looked at him. "Why did you let me walk away that first night?" The question came out of a different place than the professional ones. He knew it. She knew it. Neither of them pretended otherwise. "Because you answered honestly," he said, "and because—" he stopped, started again. "Because I was tired," he said, "of rooms where everything was calculation, of conversations where every word was a move. You said what you actually thought, and it was the first genuinely real thing anyone had said to me in a very long time." He paused. "I wasn't going to stop that just because it was inconvenient." The room was quiet. She picked up her pen and went back to the document, because the work was real, and the deadline was real, and sentiment was something neither of them had the luxury of sitting in for very long. But she was aware in the way that you become aware of things that have already happened before you fully register them. She was aware that something had shifted between them. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of declarative moment that would be easy to point to afterward. Just the slow, incremental shift of two people who had been looking at each other across a distance, deciding without announcing the decision to close it. By 6:30, she had the framework of the real case built. By 7, she found the piece of evidence she hadn't expected. The secondary network. The informant hadn't given her the one she'd found herself on that first night of processing, had a transaction thread she'd been unable to trace to its conclusion. The accounts went through 3 intermediary structures before resolishing into something identifiable. She'd flagged them and set them aside, intending to return. She returned to them now with Adrian across the table, who knew the architecture of the system better than anyone alive, and she asked him what those specific accounts connected to. He looked at the document she pushed toward him. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, his face was doing something she hadn't seen before. Not grief. Not calculation, not the controlled blankness she'd first met. Something harder than any of those things, a kind of comprehensive absolute stillness that in a person less disciplined would have looked like shock. "These accounts," he said carefully, "belong to Marco Vitelli." She waited. "Marco has been my closest friend since we were 11 years old," he said. "He is the only person in the organization I would have trusted with anything." She said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. "He built the secondary network," Adrian said. His voice was perfectly even in the way that very contained people sound perfectly, even when something has broken in a place they're not ready to show. "I didn't build that structure. I didn't know it existed." He set the document down with great precision. "Marco built it. And Marco has been feeding information to the people running this operation for... He looked at the transaction dates. At least 3 years. The silence in the room was total. Sophia watched him process it. She didn't speak. She didn't reach across the table. She gave him the space that a person needed when they discovered that someone they had trusted for 30 years had been a specific, deliberate, sustained lie. After a long moment, he looked up. "He didn't betray me because he was threatened," he said. "It wasn't a question. He did it willingly." "The transaction structure suggests a revenue arrangement," she said. "Regular payments. He's been paid well." "Why?" Adrian said. Not asking her, asking the air, the room, the incomprehensible fact of it. "Power," she said quietly. "Or fear. Or both. Sometimes people who get close to something large and dangerous spend enough time there that they start wanting the ground under their feet to be solid, even if solid means betrayal." He looked at her for a moment. "That's very generous." "I'm not being generous," she said. "I'm being accurate. Understanding why someone did something terrible doesn't make it less terrible." He was quiet. Then, "You said that before. Different words." "It keeps being true," she said. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment. She watched him. She could see the effort it took not to hide the feeling, but to put it somewhere functional. To take what had just broken and find a place for it that didn't make him unable to act. When he turned back, he was steady. "We need to move faster," he said. "If Marco is the inside source for whoever is running this operation, they'll know by now that Diane has been extracted. Marco will have told them, which means they know something has changed, and they'll move to close it." Sophia was already on her feet. "How long do we have?" "Hours," he said. "Not days." She was already gathering documents. "Then let's stop talking and finish building the case." He crossed the room to the table. He sat back down. He pulled the next folder toward him without preamble, without any of the processing she would have expected, the grief, the recrimination, the time spent in the fact of a 30-year betrayal. He put it aside and worked. That she thought watching him, that was not what monsters did. That was what someone did when they'd learned the hardest possible way that the work in front of you was the only thing you could actually control, and that control was the only form of forward motion available. She worked beside him. Outside, Chicago was waking up. Neither of them paid attention to it. They had hours and a case to build and a truth to make undeniable before the people who needed it buried could reach it. They worked. The case was finished at 9:47 in the morning. Sophia set down her pen, looked at the stack of annotated documents in front of her, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not relief, but a kind of exhausted clarity. The kind that comes when you have been completely honest about something difficult, and there is nothing left to soften or rearrange. Adrian was on the phone across the room, speaking in low, precise sentences to someone she couldn't identify. He'd been making calls for the past 40 minutes while she finished the final section of the case narrative, the part that documented with full evidentiary support the deliberate construction of a federal operation designed not to prosecute a criminal organization, but to generate leverage for a private political objective. The part that named the name she'd found on those accounts. The part that made the whole architecture visible for what it actually was. She looked at it. 3 weeks ago, she had walked into a federal building, sat down at her desk, and opened a manila folder. The woman who had done that believed with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who has not yet been tested at the level that breaks your assumptions, that the difference between the good side and the bad side was institutional. That the agency was the good side by definition. That her job was simply to be excellent at finding what was hidden. She had been excellent at finding what was hidden. The problem was that what she found wasn't what anyone had intended. Adrian finished his call and came back to the table. He looked at the completed case narrative and then at her. "Diane and her son are in a safe location," he said. "My people got to her last night before anyone else could reach her." "Is she all right?" "Frightened," he said. "Relieved. Angry in the way that people get angry when they realize they were used and that the using was sustained and deliberate." He paused. "She asked about me." Sophia looked at him. "What did she ask?" whether I was angry at her. What did you tell her? I was quiet for a moment. I told her I was not. I told her that what she did to protect her son was something I understood completely, and that the people who put her in that position would answer for it. He said it with the specific evenness of someone telling a truth they've had time to fully make peace with. Then I told her to take care of her children and not to worry about the rest of it. Sophia held his gaze. You meant it. I don't say things I don't mean. She'd noticed that. 23 days of conversation with Adrian Valenti, and not once had she caught him in a performance. He was many things controlled, guarded, capable of enormous stillness in the face of things that would have broken most people's composure entirely. But he was not a liar. It was she'd come to understand one of the more costly principles he kept. We need to talk about delivery, she said, pulling the conversation back to the immediate problem. The case needs to reach someone who can't be pressured to make it disappear. Someone with enough institutional authority to act on it before the people it documents have time to contain it. I've been thinking about that, he said. He sat down. There's a federal prosecutor in the Northern District. Her name is Catherine Marsh. She has spent the past 6 years building cases against institutional corruption, not street level, not organized crime. Political and bureaucratic corruption. She's careful, she's thorough, and she has a specific hatred for operations that use federal resources for private leverage. You know her. By reputation. She investigated a case 2 years ago that touched one of my subsidiary companies. She didn't pursue it not because she was bought, but because the evidence didn't support it, and she's the kind of person who cares about that distinction. He looked at Sophia. She's the right person. Sophia thought about it. Marsh was real. She knew the name, knew the reputation had followed 2 of her major cases from a distance. If we bring it to her directly, we bypass the chain of command that's been compromised, she said. Yes. That exposes both of us. The moment that case leaves this room, we're visible. We're already visible, he said. They called you at 5 in the morning. They know you didn't spend the night making the choice they wanted. They're already moving. She knew he was right. The 12-hour window the voice on the phone had given her had expired 90 minutes ago. Somewhere someone had registered the expiration and made a decision about what to do next. I need to call Marsh, she said. Do you have a way to reach her directly? Not through the agency system. I have a colleague who clerked for her 7 years ago. They're still in contact. She was already reaching for her phone. It's a degree of separation. It's not ideal. Make the call, he said. She made it. Her colleague, a former classmate named Peter, who was now in private practice, and who answered his phone with the specific mild panic of someone who doesn't get called before 10 on a weekday morning. Listened to her ask in carefully oblique terms whether he still had a direct line to Catherine Marsh. Sophia, he said slowly. What's happening? I need to brief her on something time-sensitive. Something that can't go through normal channels. A pause. How time-sensitive? Hours, she said. Another pause longer. I'll call you back in 5 minutes. He called back in 4. He gave her a number. He said in a voice that was trying and largely failing to be professionally detached. Whatever this is, be careful. She called the number. Catherine Marsh answered on the second ring, which meant she was either already at her desk or had been told to expect the call. Her voice was direct and unhurried in the way of someone who decided long ago not to waste energy on social lubrication. Ms. Bennett? You know who I am. Peter gave me a 30-second summary. He's concerned about you. A brief pause. So am I from what he described. Tell me what you have, Sophia told her. She took 11 minutes, and she was precise, not exhaustive, but precise enough that a federal prosecutor with Marsh's experience would be able to assess the credibility and scale of what was being presented. She didn't editorialize. She didn't advocate. She laid out the architecture of what she'd found and let it speak for itself, because the thing about a genuinely well-built case was that it didn't need help. It stood on its own, and the structure was self-evident. When she finished, the silence on the other end lasted 6 seconds. You've documented all of this, Marsh said. Yes. Physical documentation, not just digital. Both. You're aware of the exposure you're accepting by bringing this to me outside your chain of command. I am. And the individual you've been working with to develop this case is, a careful pause, Adrian Valenti. Yes. Another pause. That's going to complicate the optics considerably. I know. Tell me why I should believe that the documentation isn't itself manufactured, that Valenti hasn't used you to build a case that serves his interests rather than the public interest. It was the right question. It was the question Sophia had asked herself at 3 in the morning, and at 5 in the morning, and at various points throughout the previous night, and she had a real answer rather than a defensive one. Because the case documents his organization as well, she said, completely and accurately. I haven't protected him from anything the evidence shows. If you take this case, Adrian Valenti faces significant legal consequences. He knows that. He helped me build it anyway. The silence this time was longer. I want the physical documentation in my hands within 3 hours, Marsh said. Do you understand the logistics of making that happen without alerting anyone in your current chain of command? Yes. Then do it. A pause. Ms. Bennett, what you've described, if it's what it appears to be, is exceptionally serious. The people involved will not accept exposure without a response. I understand that. I want to make sure you understand it concretely, not abstractly, Marsh said. These are not people who will simply pursue professional consequences. You need to take your personal safety seriously beginning immediately. I understand, Sophia said again. She ended the call. Adrian was watching her. She'll take it. She wants the documentation in 3 hours. He nodded. I'll arrange transport. My people can move materials in ways that don't trigger. No, she said. It came out more sharply than she'd intended. She moderated her voice. I appreciate that, but if your people transport the case documentation, it creates a chain of custody problem. I need to move it myself. He looked at her for a moment. That means you're moving through the city alone with evidence that certain people very much want not to reach a federal prosecutor. Yes. Sophia. She looked at him. I'm aware, he said carefully, that you've been very deliberate about maintaining independence through this entire process, and I understand why. The integrity of what you've built depends on it. He paused. But I need you to tell me how you intend to manage the safety element of this, because what you described to Marsh was accurate. These are not people who will simply watch. I have a plan, she said. Tell me the plan, she told him. It was not an elaborate plan. It was a methodical one, using routes and contacts and timing in a way that minimized predictability. The kind of plan that a person who has spent their career in federal investigation builds when they need to move something important without being watched. Not flashy. Solid. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. There's a gap, he said, between the third point and the fourth. 15 minutes where you're in transit without any cover. I know. I want to close that gap. How? I'll be there, he said simply. Not visibly. Not in a way that creates a document trail or complicates your chain of custody, but present, in case the gap is used. She looked at him. She thought about professional independence and the integrity of the case and every correct reason to refuse. She thought about Catherine Marsh's voice, telling her to take her personal safety seriously beginning immediately. She thought about the gap in the plan which she had already identified and for which she had no better solution. All right, she said. He nodded once. No elaboration. No reassurance. The specific economy of a person who understood that some decisions didn't benefit from additional language. She gathered the documentation. She organized it into 2 separate packets, identical copies, because a single point of failure was not something she was willing to accept, and packed one into her work bag, and the other into a padded envelope she sealed and addressed in a way that would only make sense if the first packet was intercepted. She was almost ready to leave when her phone rang. Not her personal cell. Her work phone. The number was Harlan Webb's direct line. She looked at it for 2 full rings. Then she answered. Sophia. His voice was different from any register she'd heard from him before. Not the professional remove. Not the controlled authority. Something that was trying to sound concerned and landing somewhere adjacent to threatening without quite committing to it. We need to talk. I'm in the middle of something. I know you are, he said. That's why we need to talk now, before you do something that can't be undone. She said nothing. The investigation parameters were set for a reason, he said. I understand that you've found things that seem to complicate the picture. That's natural. Complex investigations generate complex data, and not all of it is directly relevant to the primary objective. What I need you to understand is that there are aspects of this operation that are above your clearance level, and that the decisions being made at the level where those aspects are managed are being made with full information that you don't have access to. It was extraordinarily well crafted, she noted with distant professional admiration. It was a speech designed to make her doubt her own competence without explicitly questioning it. To suggest that the thing she'd found was a misunderstanding rather than a revelation. To make her feel that the correct move, the professional appropriate deferential move, was to bring her concerns to him and let the institutional structure handle it. Harlan, she said. Did you know about the operation from the beginning? A pause. That's not a question I can answer on a monitored line. Can you answer it on any line? Another pause. Sophia, you've built an extraordinary career on being someone who operates within the structures that make this work possible. I'd hate to see that compromised by... I'll be in touch, she said, and ended the call. She looked at her phone for a moment. Then she turned it off, removed the battery old habit learned from a training seminar she'd attended 4 years ago that she'd thought at the time was excessive, and put both pieces in her jacket pocket. Adrian was watching her from across the room. That was my supervisor, she said. Yes. He knows. Yes. Which means we have less time than I calculated. She picked up her bag. She looked at him. I need to go. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her close enough that she was fully aware of him in the physical, immediate way that she had been carefully not being fully aware of for the past several hours, because it was not useful and the work required focus. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her with the specific directness he used when he was being entirely honest. The documentation reaches Marsh, he said. That's what matters. It will. Whatever happens after that. He paused. I want you to know that you were right. What you said the first night. A painful past explains actions. It doesn't erase them. I have things to answer for. Real things. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. She looked at him. I know. I'm also. He stopped. He looked like someone choosing words with great care, not because the feeling was unclear, but because he'd spent so long not doing this that the mechanics were rusty. I'm also aware that what I've asked you to risk in the past 24 hours is significant. And I'm aware that I don't have the right to ask for... Adrian, she said. He stopped. I'll see you when this is done, she said. Something moved through his expression. Yes, he said. You will. She left. The first 2 legs of the plan went exactly as she'd mapped them. Precise timing, minimal exposure, the kind of clean movement through the city that her professional training made almost mechanical. She had done high-stakes document transport twice before in her career, both times in controlled conditions with agency support. This was neither controlled nor supported, and it was significantly higher stakes than either of those prior occasions, and she was aware of all of that as a factual backdrop that she held at a functional distance because panic was not useful and presence was everything. She was on the 3rd leg, the transit portion moving through a section of the city that was neither the origin nor the destination, but the necessary passage between them when she became aware that she was being followed. Not dramatically. Not in the way that thrillers depicted, no screeching vehicles, no obvious surveillance. Just the specific pattern recognition that her training had developed and that her gut had been quietly running in the background since she left Adrian's building. A figure behind her that had been in her peripheral field for 3 blocks, maintaining a consistent distance that was slightly too consistent. The careful neutrality of someone trying to look like they were going somewhere when they were actually following something. She didn't accelerate. She didn't look directly behind her. She changed direction once smoothly with a confidence that communicated purpose rather than evasion, and then did it again 2 blocks later. The figure changed direction both times. She was being followed by at least one person, and she was still 4 minutes from the point in her plan where Adrian had said he would be present, which meant she had 4 minutes to manage this on her own. She thought clearly and quickly. She had 2 packets, one in her bag, one in the padded envelope inside her jacket. If the person following her was there to take the documentation, they would expect it in the bag. The bag was more visible, more accessible, the obvious place. She made a decision. She walked into a coffee shop, busy populated the specific kind of public space that made aggressive action difficult, and went directly to the back to the restrooms. And in the 60 seconds she was out of the line of sight of anyone in the main room, she transferred everything, essential from her bag to her jacket, redistributed weight, to make the bag feel full, and came back out with the expression of someone who had simply needed to use the facilities. She ordered a coffee at the counter. She paid for it. She ordered a coffee at the counter. She paid for it. She carried it toward the door. The figure was inside now, near the entrance. The face was unfamiliar, mid-40s, unremarkable in the deliberate way of someone professionally trained to be unremarkable. Not looking at her directly, looking slightly past her. She walked out. She walked one more block. And then 2 things happened simultaneously. A black vehicle she didn't recognize pulled to the curb 10 feet ahead of her, and the figure behind her closed the distance by half in the span of 5 seconds. She stopped walking. The vehicle's door opened. Marco Vitelli got out. She knew his face from photographs. Adrian's CFO, his closest childhood friend, the man who had built the secondary network and sold 3 decades of loyalty for regular wire transfers. He was shorter than she'd expected. His face had the particular worn quality of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has simply normalized the weight. He looked at her with something she hadn't expected, which was not aggression. It was desperation. "Ms. Bennett," he said. His voice was tight, controlled in the way that was barely maintaining the control. "I need you to give me the documentation." She stood very still. "No, you don't understand what you're doing." He took a step toward her, not aggressive, urgent. "The people who set this operation up are not the worst part of this. The people above them, the people they answer to. If this case reaches a prosecutor, the response will not be institutional. Do you understand what I'm saying? It will not be lawsuits and professional consequences. It will be—" "Why did you do it, Marco?" she said. He stopped. 3 years, she said. "Adrian trusted you with everything. Why?" Something moved across it. Complicated, layered, the expression of a man who has lived with a justification long enough that he can't fully see it anymore from the inside. "You think I wanted to," he said. "You think I woke up one day and decided to betray the man I've known since I was a child. Tell me what happened." "They had informations on me," he said. "Something from before. Something that would have destroyed not just me, my family, people I love." He was speaking faster now, the words coming loose from wherever he'd been keeping them. "They came to me and they said cooperate or we release it, and I thought if I controlled what I gave them, I could manage it. I could give them enough to keep them satisfied without giving them anything that would seriously hurt Adrian." His voice cracked on the name. "I thought I could protect him and protect myself, and nobody would. It doesn't work like that. It never works like that. And by the time I understood how bad it had gotten, I was in too deep to—" "Marco." Her voice was not unkind. "I understand what happened to you. I do. But I cannot give you this documentation. You know why." He looked at her. His face was doing something that was painful to watch, a man standing at the intersection of what he wanted to do and what he'd already done, unable to go back and afraid to go forward. "They'll come after you," he said. "When that case reaches Marsh, they'll come after you in a way that— I know. You're willing to accept that." "I don't have a different choice," she said. "Neither do you. Not really. Not anymore." The figure who had been following her was still behind her, she knew. She hadn't looked, but she was certain of it. And she became certain of something else simultaneously, the shift in weight behind Marco beside the vehicle that was not a member of his security and not a pedestrian. She held Marco's gaze and didn't look toward it. "Adrian is here," Marco said. Not a question. He'd registered it too the same way she had, through the specific alertness of someone who understood that nothing in this situation was accidental. "Yes," said Adrian's voice from 6 feet to Marco's left. Marco closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a moment that was long enough to be genuinely meaningful. When he opened them, they were directed at the ground in front of him. He looked like a person who has been holding a very large thing for a very long time, and has just finally exhaustedly set it down. "Adrian," he said. "Marco." The single word had everything in it, and none of it was fury. It was worse than fury. It was the specific grief of someone who has loved a person for 30 years and is standing in the wreckage of what that meant. "I'm sorry," Marco said. The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief or performance. It was the silence of two men standing in the ruin of something that had once been the realest thing in both their lives, and there was nothing adequate to say about it. "I know you are," Adrian said finally. "It doesn't fix it. No, it doesn't come close to fixing it. I know." Marco looked up. His face was stripped of everything, all the professional composure, all the justification, all the years of telling himself a story about what he was doing and why. He was just a man, tired, broken, looking at the person he'd betrayed. "What do you want me to do?" "The only thing left to do," Adrian said. "Tell the truth." Another silence. "They'll come after my family," Marco said. "My people will protect them," Adrian said. "You have my word." "Your word." Marco said it without irony, without calculation. Just the sound of a man registering the fact that the word of the person he'd betrayed was still even now the most reliable currency in the room. "Why would you—" "Because your family didn't betray me," Adrian said. "You did. And I'm angry enough about it that I can barely look at you. But your children had nothing to do with this, and I'm not going to punish them for what you chose." Marco put his face in his hands. He stood like that for a moment. Then he lowered his hands. He straightened. He looked at Sophia. "The documentation," he said. "Get it to Marsh. I'll provide supporting testimony." He paused. "Everything. All 3 years. I'll give it all." Sophia looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at her. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. "We need to move," she said. They moved. The remaining transit to Catherine Marsh's office took 22 minutes. Sophia didn't speak during most of it. She sat in the back of the vehicle Adrian had arranged, not a flashy one. Just a car driven by a person she didn't know who drove carefully and said nothing, and held the envelope against her chest, and felt for the first time in 36 hours, something that was not urgency or fear, or the forward-driving adrenaline of a person with a deadline. She felt the weight of what had just happened in that street. A man who had spent 30 years being betrayed by the world's assumption of what he was, who had this morning discovered that the person he'd trusted most had been doing the betraying from the inside, who had still, without hesitation, without qualification, told that man that his children would be protected. Not because it was strategic, not because it made him look good, because children didn't deserve to carry their parents' failures, and he knew what that looked like from the inside, and he had decided at some point that the cycle stopped wherever he had the power to stop it. She thought about a little girl named Rosa, 31 years old today, if the world had been different. She thought about a 12-year-old boy who had promised to protect his family and had mistaken control for protection for 20 years, and was slowly and at enormous cost learning the difference. She thought about what it meant to judge someone, not to excuse them, not to romanticize them, not to paper over the real damage that real choices cause, but to look at a person fully. The choices and the reasons and the costs and the attempts at repair. To hold all of it at once, without letting any single piece of it define the whole. She thought that was the hardest thing a person could do, and that she had been trying to do it honestly since the night she walked into a dark office and found a man crying over a photograph. The vehicle stopped. She got out. She walked into Catherine Marsh's building, with the documentation held in both hands. She was done thinking. It was time for the world to know what was actually true. Marsh was waiting in her office on the 6th floor. She was smaller than Sophia had expected, and significantly more present, the kind of person whose attention, when it was fully directed at you, felt like a physical thing. She took the documentation from Sophia's hands, set it on her desk, and spent 45 seconds looking at the first 3 pages. Then she looked up. "I'm going to need you to walk me through all of it," she said. "Start at the beginning." "A folder on my desk," Sophia said. "3 weeks ago, a man standing rather than sitting." Marsh looked at her. "I'll explain," Sophia said. She sat down and she explained everything. She told the truth, the complete, unreduced, uncomfortable truth about all of it. She didn't protect herself. She didn't protect Adrian more than the evidence warranted. She laid it out the way she'd been trained to lay out a case, factually precisely, with the evidence visible, and the reasoning transparent, and the conclusion available for anyone to reach independently by following the same steps. Halfway through, Marsh picked up her phone and made a call. She said 4 words into it, "I need you here." Then she hung up and turned back to Sophia and said, "Continue." Sophia continued. Outside Marsh's window. Chicago went about the business of being a city. Ordinary and loud, and completely indifferent to the fact that in a 6th-floor office, the architecture of a sustained institutional deception was being laid bare by a woman who had started her morning believing she knew which side she was on. She knew now. She had always known, actually. She'd just needed to find the evidence. The briefing lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Sophia knew the exact time because she watched the clock on Marsh's wall move through it, the way you watch a clock when your body is running on no sleep, and the adrenaline that had been carrying you has finally begun to thin, and what's underneath it is something rawer and less manageable. She talked. She answered questions. She walked Marsh and the 2 additional prosecutors who had arrived, a man named Gerald Howe and a woman named Patricia Lynn, both of whom had the specific focused intensity of people who understood they were looking at something significant through every layer of the documentation. She was precise. She was complete. She did not editorialize, and she did not advocate, and she did not at any point attempt to make Adrian Valenti look like something other than what the evidence showed he was, which was a man who had built and maintained a criminal organization for 2 decades, and who had in the past several weeks made choices that were going to cost him significantly in legal terms, regardless of what else was true about him. She said that plainly when Marsh asked her to characterize her relationship with Valenti. "He helped me build an accurate case," she said, "including the parts that document his own culpability. I believe his cooperation is genuine, and I believe his stated intention to cooperate fully with prosecution is genuine. I also believe he understands clearly what cooperation means and is not operating under any illusion about the outcome for himself." Marsh looked at her steadily. And personally, the question landed in the room with a precision that told Sophia it had been coming since the beginning of the briefing, and that Marsh had simply waited for the right moment to ask it. "Personally," Sophia said, "I think he's a more complicated person than his file suggests. I think complication is not a legal defense, and he knows that, and I know that." She held Marsh's gaze. "I also think the question of who he is as a person is separate from the question of what the evidence shows, and the evidence is what I've given you." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and moved to the next question, and the personal dimension of the inquiry was closed, at least for that room. When Sophia walked out of the federal building at 2:17 in the afternoon, the city was doing what it always did. Indifferent, relentless moving. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it move around her. She was exhausted in a way that was past the point where exhaustion felt like anything in particular. She was also underneath everything more settled than she'd felt in 3 weeks. She had done the right thing. Not the easy thing, not the safe thing, not the career-preserving thing, the right thing. She knew the difference, and she'd stopped apologizing for caring about it somewhere around 5 in the morning, when a man had told her with great precision and no drama that she could leave, and he wouldn't stop her. She'd stayed. That choice at this point was simply part of who she was. Her phone, her personal cell, reassembled, battery replaced, showed 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. She listened to the first voicemail. The voice was the same one that had called her at 5 in the morning. The pleasant, measured voice, with the thin edge of something cold underneath it. But the pleasantness was different now, compressed like something being held under pressure. "Ms. Bennett, You've made a significant error in judgment. I'd encourage you to consider that errors of this magnitude have consequences that extend well beyond professional inconvenience. I'd further encourage you to consider that the people you've chosen to align yourself with are not capable of protecting you from those consequences. Call me back. There's still a version of this that ends reasonably well for you. She deleted it without listening to the other two. She called Adrian. He answered before the first ring completed. Are you all right? I'm fine. It's done. Has everything. A pause short, but she'd learned to read his pauses, the different textures of them. This one was relief. Good. I got a voicemail, she said. From the voice. He's moved from pressure to threat. I know. My people flagged increased movement about an hour ago. His voice was even. Where are you? Outside Marsh's building. Don't go home, he said immediately. Not yet. Is there somewhere? I'll come to you, she said. Another pause, different texture from the first one. All right, he said. She got in a cab. She kept her eyes on the street behind her the whole way. She was being followed again, she was almost certain of it, but differently from the morning. Less directly, more at a distance, which could mean they were uncertain about what she'd done, or it could mean they were waiting. Watching. Building toward something. She made 3 unnecessary turns and changed cabs twice, and arrived at Adrian's building 23 minutes later than the direct route would have taken. I was waiting in the lobby. Not downstairs in the lobby, which meant he'd come down from wherever he'd been when she called, which meant he'd been watching for her. She noticed that. She filed it without comment. You made the call longer than necessary, he said, looking at her. I wanted to be certain I wasn't followed here. Were you? Possibly. I'm less certain than I'd like to be. He nodded. He turned toward the elevator without further question, which she appreciated because she was tired of questions, and the elevator ride was 30 seconds of silence that she badly needed. In his apartment, she sat down on the couch with the specific quality of someone whose body has decided that it is finished with voluntary upright positioning and sat there for a moment without speaking. He brought her coffee. He sat across from her. He didn't fill the silence. That was something she'd been noticing about him with increasing clarity over the past week, the way he understood that silence was not always a gap to be filled. That sometimes the most respectful thing you could do for another person was give them space to exist in a moment without requiring them to perform being fine. Marsh is moving fast, she said finally. She had 2 additional prosecutors in the room within 90 minutes of my arrival. She made calls while I was briefing her. She was building a strategy as I was still presenting the evidence. She's not waiting. Good, he said. The people who set up the operation will know something happened. They may not know the specifics yet, but the movement alone will tell them. She looked at him. What are your people telling you? That there's been a significant increase in communication between 2 specific parties who don't typically communicate directly. He set his coffee down. One of those parties is the individual whose name appears on the secondary network accounts. He knows. He suspects. There's a distinction, but it's closing fast. She absorbed that. What does he do when suspicion becomes certainty? He has options, Adrian said. Most of them require a period of time to implement institutional options, legal options, the kind of pressure that works through channels rather than directly. Those take time. And the non-institutional options. He looked at her steadily. Those are faster. The room was quiet. I'm not going to hide, she said, not defiantly, just stating a position. I know. I'm not going to stop working. I'm not going to retract anything or back away from Marsh or act as though I'm afraid of the consequences of what I... Sophia. His voice was quiet. I know. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? I was quiet for a moment. I'm asking you to let me deal with the immediate physical risk while you deal with everything else. He met her eyes. Not because you can't manage it. Because I can manage it better. And it's the one part of this where my capabilities are actually relevant. She looked at him. She thought about the 12-foot distance between them in a hospital corridor. The blocked number calls. The person waiting in the gap, she couldn't cover herself that morning on the street. She thought about what it cost a man who had spent 20 years confusing control with protection to say, "I'll deal with this part and let you handle the rest," and mean it. "All right," she said. She drank her coffee. An hour later, Harlan Webb was arrested. She found out from Marsh, who called her personal cell with the brevity of someone who knows the recipient will need the information and won't require context. Webb and 2 other individuals within the agency have been taken into custody based on preliminary documentation. 3 additional warrants are being processed. The individual at the top of the chain, the one whose name appears on the secondary accounts, has been served with a preservation order and will be arraigned within 48 hours pending review of the full case documentation. Sophia sat very still. "You did good work," Marsh said. Not warmly, Marsh didn't operate in warmth, but with a precision that made the words land as genuine rather than performative. "The documentation is clean. The evidentiary chain holds. This is going to be a significant case." "What about Valenti?" Sophia asked. A pause. "Mr. Valenti's counsel has been in contact with my office since this morning," Marsh said. Apparently, he anticipated this call. Something in her voice that might from a different person have been dry amusement. "He is prepared to cooperate fully with prosecution of his own organization's criminal activities in exchange for considerations that his counsel is prepared to negotiate. I've agreed to the negotiation." Another pause. "He's also provided documentation of his own that my office did not previously have financial records and testimony that significantly extend the evidentiary reach of the case." Sophia absorbed that. "He built more than just what we put together last night." "Considerably more," Marsh said. "He's been documenting his own organization for approximately 14 months. Quietly, methodically, without telling anyone." A beat. "The documentation he provided covers aspects of the organization's operations that your investigation hadn't reached yet. 14 months. The same length of time Diane Caruso had been compromised. The same period that Marco had been feeding information to the operation. Adrian had known something was wrong for 14 months. Not the specifics, not Marco, but the shape of it, and had spent that time building a case against himself, laying the groundwork for an exit that was also a reckoning. He hadn't told her that. He'd helped her build a case and handed over evidence he'd spent over a year collecting, and said nothing about it." She ended the call with Marsh. She walked to where Adrian was on the phone across the room and stood in front of him until he finished the call and looked at her. 14 months, she said. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Yes. You've been building documentation of your own organization for 14 months. "Yes. While someone was using your organization to run a leverage operation against you, and your informant was being coerced, and your closest friend was betraying you." "Yes." She looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" I was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed you to build your case without the influence of knowing what I already had," he said. "If you knew I'd been documenting, you might have oriented toward what I'd found, rather than building independently. The value of 2 separate evidentiary chains is precisely that they're separate." He held her gaze. "And because I didn't know you. 3 weeks ago, I didn't know you. You know me now." "Yes," he said. "I do." The space between them was quiet and had the particular density of a moment that has more in it than either person is currently saying. Her phone rang. It wasn't Marsh this time. It wasn't a blocked number. It was a number she didn't recognize, but that her phone identified with an area code from Springfield, Illinois, the state capital. She answered. "Ms. Bennett." The voice was older than she expected, measured in a completely different way from the voice she'd been getting calls from. This had the texture of genuine authority rather than performed calm. "My name is David Caulfield. I'm the Deputy Attorney General for the state of Illinois. I've been briefed on the situation by Prosecutor Marsh in the past hour." She said nothing. "I'm calling to inform you that the preservation order on Daniel Hartwell has been upgraded to a federal arrest warrant effective 45 minutes ago." A pause. "Daniel Hartwell was the voice on those calls, Ms. Bennett. He's been the operational architect of what we're now treating as a federal RICO conspiracy charge." Another pause. I want you to know that the documentation you provided, combined with what Mr. Valenti's counsel delivered this morning, is among the most comprehensive evidentiary packages my office has reviewed in many years of prosecutorial work. She sat down. Thank you. I also want to say something personally, Caulfield said. What you did, the decision you made with the information you found, was not an easy decision, and it was not a safe one. I'm aware of that. I'm aware of it too, she said. You'll face consequences professionally. Your career path inside the agency is effectively closed at this point. You've made powerful enemies. He said it matter-of-factly, not unkindly. What you will also have is the full institutional support of this office as the case moves forward, and my personal assurance that your cooperation will be documented and recognized in whatever capacity is available to me. She thanked him. She ended the call. Adrian had been watching her face during the call, the way he watched things with full attention and without intrusion, reading what was visible without demanding what wasn't. Hartwell is being arrested, she said. Something moved through his expression. Not triumph. Something more complicated and less clean than triumph. Marco's testimony will be central to the prosecution, she said. Is he cooperating fully? My people confirmed it an hour ago, he said. He turned himself into Marsh's office at noon. He came alone. A pause. He left a message for me through his attorney. What did it say? That he was sorry. That he knows sorry is not enough. That he wanted me to know he told the truth voluntarily. No plea negotiation first, no deal arranged. He walked in and told the truth because it was the only thing left that was his to give. Sophia held his gaze. She could see what it cost him to hold the two things simultaneously. The betrayal and the love, the anger and the grief, the 30 years and the 3 years of lie that ran through them like a fault line. What are you going to do? About Marco. About all of it. I was quiet for a long moment. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood there the way he'd stood that morning. The posture she'd learned to recognize as the one where he was putting something in order before he spoke. Not avoiding the question, building toward an answer that was actually honest. The organization is going to change, he said, completely. It's not negotiable legally or morally. It's not something I can preserve in its current form, and I'm not going to try. He turned from the window. There are legitimate operations that can survive and grow. There are people whose livelihoods have been inside this structure for years, and who will need transition and support. I've been working on a plan for both. He looked at her. The criminal elements, the parallel structure, the operations that don't survive legal scrutiny, those end. Not because Marsh is forcing them to end, because they should end. They should have ended years ago. What took so long? She asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He looked at her for a moment. Fear, he said, and it came out with the particular difficulty of a man naming a thing he's spent considerable energy not naming. Not of the people I was competing with or the legal consequences. Fear of the structure was the thing I'd built when I had nothing. When my parents were gone and Rosa was gone and there was nothing left except what I could control. Dismantling it felt like... He stopped. Like admitting it was wrong. And admitting it was wrong meant sitting with what it cost other people. And that was... He stopped again. Hard, she said. Very, he said. She stood up from the couch. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him the same way he'd stopped in front of her that morning before she walked into the most important thing she'd ever done, and she looked at him with the fullness that she'd been trying to balance with professional distance for 3 weeks, and that she was now with professional distance no longer structurally relevant, simply feeling. A painful past explains your actions, she said. I stand by that. So do I, he said. It doesn't excuse them. No, she agreed. But you're not trying to excuse them. You've spent 14 months building a case against yourself. You protected a woman who was betraying you because her child was being threatened. You told the man who betrayed you for 3 years that his family would be safe. She held his gaze. Those aren't the actions of someone who's using the past as a shield. Those are the actions of someone who's decided to be different from what the past made them. He looked at her for a long moment. I've made a lot of mistakes, he said. I know. Real ones. With real costs to real people. I know that too. And you're still standing here. I'm standing here, she said. Something in his face changed. Not broke open. Not the controlled collapse she'd seen in his office that first night, but opened. Deliberately. With the specific intention of letting her see it, which was different from the involuntary exposure of a man caught crying in the dark, and very much more significant. I don't know how to do this, he said. The normal version of this, whatever this is. Neither do I, she said. I've never built a federal corruption case from inside someone's kitchen before. Something that was fully, completely a smile crossed his face. Real. Reaching his eyes. The kind that changed the whole structure of a face and made you realize you'd been seeing a diminished version of a person for weeks. That's a specific kind of first date, he said. It's a memorable one, she said. He reached up and put his hand against the side of her face, and she let him and the city outside continued its indifferent, relentless noise, and neither of them paid any attention to it. The moment was brief, not because either of them wanted it to be, but because the world had not stopped moving, simply because something important had happened between two people. His phone rang with the particular tone he'd assigned to his legal team. She pulled back. He answered. She listened to him say yes, understood, confirmed in the clipped precision of a man moving quickly through the practical reality of a situation. She watched his face while he talked the difference between the controlled professional mask and whatever this other thing was, the version of him that existed outside the performance. She thought it was probably the version very few people had ever seen. He finished the call. My legal team needs me, he said. Go, she said. There's a guest room, he said. You're not going home tonight. It's not safe yet. I wasn't planning to go home tonight, she said. I have about 16 hours of legal documentation to review before Marcia's next briefing tomorrow morning. He looked at her. You're not... He stopped. You're reviewing documentation tonight. Someone has to make sure the evidentiary chain is airtight before it reaches a courtroom, she said. Your legal team has its piece. I have mine. Sophia. Something in his voice was between exasperation and something much warmer than exasperation. You have slept for 3 hours in the past 36. I'm aware. You are. He stopped again. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. You are genuinely the most relentlessly functional person I have ever met. I'll take that as a compliment. It was intended as one mixed with significant concern for your well-being. She almost smiled. Go meet with your legal team. I'll be here when you get back. He held her gaze for a moment. Yes, he said. You will. And there was something in the way he said it that turned a simple confirmation into something much more careful and much more certain than confirmation. He left. She got the documentation from her bag and sat down at his kitchen table and started working. 3 hours later, she found it. The thing she hadn't expected. The thing that changed the shape of what she thought she already understood. Buried inside the supplementary documentation that Adrian's legal team had forwarded the 14 months of records he'd built before she ever walked into his building, there was a file. Not financial. Personal. A set of communications between Daniel Hartwell and a third party she hadn't previously identified, predating the operation against Adrian by 4 years. She read it once quickly. Then she read it again slowly. Then she sat back in her chair and understood something that landed with the quiet, comprehensive weight of a thing that reframes everything around it. 4 years ago, before any of the current operation existed, Hartwell had been the point of contact for a different operation, one that targeted a different organization in a different city. An operation that had resulted in a conviction. A prosecution that had been celebrated publicly as a significant win against organized crime. The conviction had been built on evidence that this file suggested had been partially fabricated, and the man who had been convicted, the man who had gone to federal prison on the basis of evidence that Hartwell had helped shape, was named Carlo Marchetti. She recognized the name. She'd seen it once briefly in a case summary she'd read months ago that had nothing to do with anything she'd since been working on. A footnote in someone else's file. She pulled up everything she could access and cross-referenced it. Carlo Marchetti. Convicted 8 years ago. Sentenced to 22 years. Currently serving in a federal correctional facility in Indiana. He had a son. She found the son's name in the margin of one of Hartwell's communications, a note almost incidental, the kind that gets written when someone is thinking out loud in a private document and doesn't expect another person to ever read it. The son's name was Marco Vitelli. Sophia sat very still. Marco Vitelli. Adrian's childhood friend. His CFO. The man who had built the secondary network and sold 3 decades of loyalty to Daniel Hartwell. Marco, whose mother had remarried when he was a teenager and taken her new husband's name. Marco, who had grown up knowing his biological father had been convicted of crimes the family always insisted he hadn't committed. Marco, who had been approached by Hartwell 14 months ago, not threatened, not coerced, recruited. Recruited with information, with documents, with the suggestion that cooperation with Hartwell's operation would eventually produce the leverage needed to re-examine his father's case. Not money, not blackmail. A son trying to free his father. She closed her eyes. She sat like that for a long moment. When she opened them, she picked up her phone and called Marsh. Marsh answered on the first ring. Bennett. I found something, Sophia said. Inside the supplementary documentation. Something that changes the Marco Vitelli picture significantly. A pause. How significantly? Enough that I think his cooperation needs to be treated differently than we're currently treating it, she said. And enough that there's an additional case that needs to be examined. A conviction from 8 years ago. Silence. Send me what you have, Marsh said. Tonight. Sending now, Sophia said. She sent it. She sat back. She thought about Marco standing in the street with his face stripped of everything saying, I'm sorry. In the voice of a man who had done a terrible thing for a reason that was underneath all the damage it had caused, recognizable. Human. The reason that sons do things for fathers, and fathers do things for children, and people bend themselves into shapes they were never supposed to hold, because love under pressure becomes something you can barely recognize as love. She heard the apartment door open. She heard Adrian's footsteps. She'd learned the specific weight and rhythm of them over the past week, in ways she hadn't consciously registered until just now. He came into the kitchen. He looked at her face and stopped. What happened? He said. Sit down, she said. I need to tell you something about Marco. He sat down. She told him. She watched his face as she laid it out. The documentation, the 4-year history. Hartwell's communications, the convicted man in a federal facility in Indiana. The son who had believed that betrayal was the price of his father's freedom. She watched the anger in Adrian's face move through several transformations. Anger at Marco. Anger at Hartwell for weaponizing a son's grief. Anger at the years of not knowing. And then something that was harder to watch than the anger, the slow, terrible comprehension of a man realizing that the person he'd believed had chosen to betray him had actually been broken by a grief Adrian recognized at the cellular level, because he had lived it himself. The loss of a parent. The rage at injustice. The decision to do whatever it took. He never told me, Adrian said, about his father, about any of it. He couldn't, she said. If he told you, you'd have helped him, and Hartwell needed Marco isolated. Hartwell needed Marco to believe the only path to his father was through cooperation with the operation. Adrian was quiet for a long time. Is his father actually innocent? He said. I don't know yet, she said. Marsh is looking at it tonight. But the documentation suggests the conviction relied on evidence that Hartwell shaped, which means at minimum there are questions. 30 years, Adrian said. Not about Marco's betrayal, about something older. 30 years I've known him, since we were 11. We were at each other's father's funerals. He paused. He was at my sister's funeral. She said nothing. She let that land where it needed to land. He should have told me, Adrian said. Yes, she said. He should have. I would have. He stopped. I know, she said. He should have trusted that. Why didn't he? She thought about it honestly. Because when you're a son trying to save your father, she said carefully, and someone tells you the only way to do it is alone, you believe them, because you want to believe there's a way, even if the way is wrong. She held his gaze. You understand that? He looked at her. The thing you'd do for Rosa, she said. The thing you did do. The world you walked into to protect your family. She held his gaze. Marco did the same thing. The wrong thing for the same reason. The silence was long. I need to think about this, he said. I know. I'm still angry. I know that too. Both things are true simultaneously. Yes, she said. They usually are. He looked at her across the table. How do you do that? Do what? Hold things without flattening them, without needing them to be simpler than they are. She thought about it. I think it's because I spent my career looking for what was actually there instead of what was supposed to be there, she said. The numbers don't care what story you want them to tell. They tell the true one. She paused. People are the same way. If you look at them honestly, they tell you the true story, even when the true story is complicated. He nodded slowly. The true story of Marco, she said, is that he's a man who betrayed someone he loved to save someone he loved. He made choices that caused real damage. He also needs someone to now look at his situation with the same honesty I tried to bring to yours. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. You're asking me to help him, he said. I'm asking you to let the truth about his father be examined, she said. What you do with Marco personally, that's yours to decide. I'm not asking you to forgive anything on a timeline that isn't real. He was quiet. Then slowly he reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. I didn't say anything. He didn't need to. It was the kind of gesture that a person makes when they have chosen not impulsively, not dramatically, but with the considered weight of someone who has looked at a complicated truth and decided that the complicated truth is still worth moving toward. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside the city continued its noise. Inside, two people who had arrived at each other through the strangest possible road sat at a kitchen table with the truth between them and found in the exhausted, honest, unadorned reality of the moment that it was enough. More than enough. It was in fact exactly what it had always needed to be. Marsh called at 6:43 in the morning. Sophia was already awake. She'd slept 4 hours on the guest room bed without fully undressing, which was not restful in the traditional sense, but was more than she'd managed in the previous 2 days combined. She answered on the first ring. Carlo Marchetti's conviction is being reviewed, Marsh said without greeting, because Marsh never used greetings, and at this point, Sophia had stopped expecting them. I had 3 people working through the night on the documentation you sent. The evidence Hartwell shaped, we can demonstrate fabrication on at least 2 critical pieces. The original trial prosecutor is cooperating. He had no knowledge of the fabrication and he's furious. A pause. This is going to move fast. How fast? Emergency review hearing within 72 hours. If the fabrication holds, and it will hold, the documentation is unambiguous. Marchetti could be released pending retrial within the week. Sophia sat up. Does Marco know? Not yet. His attorney has been informed that new information is being reviewed. Nothing specific. Another pause. I thought you might want to tell him. She hadn't expected that. Me? You found it, Marsh said simply. And frankly, the way you found it, what you understood about why he did what he did. I think you're the right person. A beat. I'm not a warm individual, Ms. Bennett. You may have noticed. But I know when something human is required, and I know when it's not my skill set. Sophia almost smiled. I'll go today. Oh. His attorney will arrange access. A pause. One more thing. Hartwell's arraignment is at 10 this morning. It's going to be public. It's going to be significant. You should be prepared for your name to appear in the coverage. I expected that. Your career inside the agency is, as I think you already know, effectively over. Yes. My office has a position, Marsh said. If you want it. Investigative counsel focused on institutional corruption cases. It's different work from what you've been doing. More complicated in some ways. Less in others. She paused. I don't make this offer to many people. I'm making it to you because in 30 years of prosecutorial work, I have rarely seen someone do what you did with the information you found, and I want that capability in my office." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." Marsh ended the call. Sophia sat in the guest room with the phone in her hand and the gray morning coming through the window. 31 days ago, she had opened a manila folder and looked at a photograph of a man who looked away from cameras. She had believed with the uncomplicated confidence that preceded real testing that she understood the difference between the good side and the bad side. She still believed in that difference. She simply understood now that the line ran through people rather than between them. She got up. She washed her face. She walked into the kitchen. Adrian was already there. He had coffee made, which she had come to understand was his version of saying, "I was waiting for you," without saying it. He looked at her when she came in with the specific attention that she was still adjusting to the complete kind, the kind that took in everything and wasn't performing interest, but simply had it. "Marsh called," she said. "I know. She called me 20 minutes ago as well." She sat down. He handed her coffee. "She told you about Marco's father?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She also told me about the position she offered you." She looked at him. "She told you about that. She told me she'd offered it, and that it would mean remaining in Chicago." He held her gaze with the same directness he used when he was being entirely honest, and had decided not to protect himself from the exposure of it. "I think she wanted me to know because she thought it was relevant information for me to have." "Is it?" "Yes," he said, simply, without qualification. She drank her coffee. "I'm going to see Marco today." Something moved through his expression, the complicated layering she'd watched him navigate since the night she'd told him the truth about his oldest friend. The anger and the grief and the recognition, none of them resolved, all of them present simultaneously. "I know," he said. "Do you want to come?" I was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, what he wanted, what was wise, what the right thing was at this exact stage of something that had no established protocol. "Not yet," he said finally. "He needs to hear about his father first, from you. Without me there complicating what he needs to feel." She looked at him. "You've thought about this carefully." "I've been thinking about it since 2 in the morning, he said. "I don't sleep well when there's something unresolved." "You should have told me. I wasn't sleeping well either." "I know. I heard you get up twice." He paused. "I didn't want to intrude." She looked at him across the table. 41 years old. A man who had spent 2 decades being something that frightened people, and a not inconsiderable amount of time, she now understood. Being frightened himself, not of the external things, but of the internal ones. The darkness he'd described. The version of himself that the world had created and that he had chosen at significant cost not to become. "Adrian," she said. He looked at her. "What you did last night, letting me tell you about Marco and sitting with it and thinking it through and arriving at the right thing without anyone telling you it was the right thing." She paused. "That's not nothing." "It's the minimum." "The minimum," he said. "For most people, it would be the maximum," she said. "I want you to know I see the difference." I was quiet for a moment. Then carefully. "I've spent a lot of years not being seen accurately," he said. "Not the monster version, and not the whatever the other version is. The one people want when they discover there's a complicated story. The redemption narrative. The reformed criminal with a heart of gold." His voice was even and precise. "I'm not either of those things. I'm someone who made real choices that caused real damage and is now trying to do real repair. It's not a narrative. It's just work." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you I see it." The moment settled between them, quiet and substantial. Then her phone rang. The number was her mother's. She'd missed 4 calls from her mother in the past 2 days and had sent 2 texts that said everything is fine, call you soon, which were technically true in a very selective way. She answered. "Sophia Marie Bennett," her mother said, in the voice that had not changed since Sophia was 17 and had stayed out past curfew. "Hi, Mom. I have been watching the news this morning." Sophia closed her eyes briefly. It's on the news. Daniel Hartwell, who I have never heard of, is being arraigned for federal conspiracy charges, and your name was mentioned twice as the investigator whose work was central to the case. And I am sitting here in my kitchen in Cincinnati trying to understand why my daughter did not call me. I've been busy. I can see that. A pause. Her mother's voice changed from the 17-year-old curfew register to something softer and more urgent. Are you all right, truly? Truly, Sophia said. Yes, I am. Are you safe? Yes. A pause. Her mother was the kind of woman who processed things completely before speaking, which Sophia had inherited, and which served neither of them well in conversations that required speed. The news said there are federal charges against people inside the agency, her mother said finally. People above you. Yes. Sophia, how long have you known that was what you were inside? About 3 weeks, she said. The silence on the other end was the specific silence of a mother, understanding that her child walked into something very dangerous and walked out of it intact, and the relief and the retroactive terror arriving simultaneously. I need you to call me more, her mother said. Her voice was steady, and she was clearly holding it steady by an act of will. Whatever you're doing, whoever you're with, whatever complicated, dangerous thing is happening, I need you to call me. I will, Sophia said. Promise me. I promise, Mom. Another pause. Who is with you? Sophia looked across the table at Adrian, who had the focused, elsewhere gaze of a person giving another person privacy during a personal call while being completely present in the room. Someone I trust, Sophia said. Good, her mother said. That's good. A beat. Is he handsome? Mom. I'm a mother, not a saint. Sophia almost laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that surprises you before you can stop it. Yes, she said. He's handsome. Adrian looked at her with a single raised eyebrow, and she shook her head slightly, and the entire exchange happened in the silent vocabulary of two people who have arrived at a shorthand without consciously building it. She finished the call. She stood up. I need to go see Marco. I know. I'll call you when I'm done. I'll be here. He said it the same way he'd said it the night before, with the weight of something more than a logistical fact. The specific certainty of a person who has decided where they're standing. She went. Marco was being held in a federal facility on the north side of the city, pending the processing of the cooperation agreement his attorney was finalizing with Marsh's office. He'd turned himself in voluntarily. That mattered legally, and it mattered in ways that were harder to quantify, but no less real. His attorney, a careful woman named Sandra Reese, who looked like she hadn't slept either, met Sophia in the waiting area and said quietly, He doesn't know why you're here. He thinks it's additional debrief. Has he asked about Adrian? A pause. 3 times since last night. Sophia nodded. All right. Marco was brought into the interview room 2 minutes later. He looked worse than he had on the street, not physically damaged, but diminished in a way that was more than exhaustion. The look of someone who has let go of the thing that was holding them up and hasn't yet found what replaces it. He sat down across from her and looked at his hands on the table. I've already told Marsh's people everything I know, he said. His voice was flat, depleted. Whatever additional questions? I'm not here for additional debrief, she said. He looked up. I'm here because I found something last night in the documentation Adrian provided to Marsh's office, she said. Something about your father. The change in Marco's face was immediate and total. Every carefully constructed layer of the depleted cooperating making, peace with the consequences man, evaporated. What was underneath was something raw and young and ferociously alive in a way that nothing else in his current circumstances had produced. What about my father? He said. She told him. She was direct and she was complete, and she didn't cushion it because Marco was not a man who needed cushioning, and because the truth was good enough to be told plainly. She told him about the documentation inside Hartwell's files, the fabricated evidence, the original trial prosecutor's cooperation, the emergency review hearing, the 72-hour timeline. She watched his face process it in real time. The disbelief first, The specific resistance of a person who has hoped for something a very long time and has trained themselves not to hope too hard, because hope is the most dangerous thing a person in his position carries. Then the disbelief ceding ground to something else slowly like ice in spring. His eyes filled. I didn't let the tears fall. He pressed them back with the determination of a man who had learned to manage emotion in circumstances that did not permit its display. But his hands on the table were shaking, and he made no effort to hide that. "He didn't do it," Marco said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "We believe there are significant grounds to demonstrate that the conviction was compromised," she said carefully. "The review will establish the specifics." "He didn't do it," Marco said again. "Not to her, to the heir, to the 8 years, to the version of himself that had believed with the faith of a child who could not accept the alternative that his father was innocent, and that the world had simply failed to see it." "No," she said. "I don't think he did." Marco put both hands over his face. The sound he made was not dramatic. It was the sound a person makes when they have been carrying something enormous for so long that they've lost the ability to feel its weight, and someone finally takes it, and the absence of the weight is almost indistinguishable from falling. She sat with him. She didn't speak. She gave him the time. After a while he lowered his hands. His face was wet, and he didn't bother to address it. "Hartwell told me," he said, "that the only way to get the case reviewed was to generate enough pressure through the operation to force the right people to act. That the documentation I gathered on Valenti Group would give them leverage to make it happen." He paused. "I knew it was wrong. I knew it every day. But I believed—" He stopped. "I needed to believe there was a way." "I know," she said. "Adrian," he said. "Does he—" "He knows about your father," she said. "I told him last night." Marco was quiet for a moment. "How angry is he?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Very," she said. "And also," she paused, "he understands why you did what you did. Both things are true at the same time." "That sounds like him," Marco said with a quality in his voice that was grief and love in approximately equal measure. "He always could hold two things at once. I never could." He looked at the table. "I should have told him. About my father, about all of it. The beginning before any of this. He would have—" "He said the same thing," she said. Marco looked up. "He said you should have trusted him." She held his gaze. "He's not wrong, but I also understand why a man who is trying to save his father doesn't trust anyone with it, even someone he loves." Marco was quiet. "What happens now," she said, "is that you cooperate fully with Marcia's office, which you're already doing. Your father's case gets reviewed, which is already happening. And you deal with your own legal situation with the same honesty you brought to turning yourself in." She paused. "The rest, Adrian, what that relationship is from here, that's between you and him. I can't tell you what it becomes, but I don't think it becomes nothing." "How can you know that?" "Because he told me his people would protect your family," she said. "Before he knew about your father. Before there was any additional context that might make that easier to offer." She held his gaze. "He did it because your children didn't do anything wrong. That's who he is. And that doesn't disappear because you hurt him." Marco looked at her for a long moment. "He trusts you," he said. "I know. I've known Adrian Valenti for 30 years, Marco said. "He has never in 30 years trusted someone the way he trusts you. I watched it happen in the middle of everything, and it was the most unexpected thing I'd seen in years." He paused. "Don't waste it." "I don't intend to," she said. She left the facility at noon. She sat in the car for a moment before she drove. She thought about a father sitting in a federal correctional facility in Indiana waiting. She thought about a son who had broken 30 years of loyalty because of a love that, however badly it had expressed itself, was still recognizably love. She thought about how often the things that caused the most damage were not absence of feeling, but excess of it badly directed under impossible pressure. Then she drove back across the city. 3 weeks later, Daniel Hartwell was formally indicted on 7 federal counts, including conspiracy evidence fabrication and abuse of federal authority. 2 additional individuals from Harlan Webb's chain of command, pleaded guilty to related charges within days of the indictment. Webb himself, facing a comprehensive evidentiary case that his own attorneys described privately as nearly impossible to contest, entered a cooperation agreement. Carlo Marchetti was released from the federal correctional facility in Indiana on a Tuesday morning. Marco was there. Marco's children were there. The moment was private. No cameras, no statement to the press, arranged through Marcia's office, with the specific discretion of people who understood that some things were not public events. Adrian knew it was happening. He did not go. He stayed in his office, and he worked because there were things he and Marco had to rebuild, and they would rebuild them in their own time. And the beginning of that was giving Marco the thing he'd broken himself trying to get and stepping back from it. He told Sophia this at dinner that evening, a real dinner at a table in a restaurant, the most normal thing either of them had done in a month, which they both acknowledged was slightly absurd and was fine. "Did it feel right?" she asked. "Not going." "Yes," he said. "It was Marco's moment, not mine." "That's a different kind of instinct from the one you used to have," she said. He looked at her. "Which instinct did I used to have?" "The one where you made everything about control," she said, not unkindly, "where being present and in charge was the same as being safe." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It is different." "It's better," she said. He looked at her across the table, with the same fullness she'd first seen that morning in his kitchen, the version of him that was not performing or protecting. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me. The question you asked me the first night, in my office." He paused. "Whether I was a monster." "I remember. You said monsters are the ones who stop caring that they hurt people." He held her gaze. "I've been thinking about that as a definition. It's a better one than most." "Why?" "Because it locates the thing in the ongoing," he said. "Not in what you've done, but in whether you still have the capacity to care that you did it." He paused. "Which means it's not fixed. It's not a permanent state. It's a choice that gets made continuously." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it means. I'm going to keep caring," he said. "That's the only thing I can commit to with certainty. Not that I won't make mistakes. Not that the process of dismantling what I built won't cause additional damage in ways I can't fully anticipate, but that I'll keep caring when it does." "That's enough," she said. "Is it?" "It's the only thing that ever is," she said. He reached across the table and touched her hand. She turned hers over and held his. The restaurant moved around them with its ordinary indifferent noise, and neither of them paid attention to it. She accepted Marcia's position the following Monday. She called her mother to tell her. Her mother cried briefly in the specific way of a woman who is relieved and proud and has been frightened on her daughter's behalf and is trying not to let the frightened part win. Then she asked 3 questions about Adrian in rapid succession, and Sophia answered them patiently, and at one point laughed again, the surprised kind, the real kind. And her mother said, "You sound different, Sophia." And she said, "I think I am." And her mother said, "Good." The Valenti Group restructuring took the better part of 8 months. It was not clean. It was not linear. It was the specific difficulty of unwinding something that had been built over 2 decades, with the added complexity of doing so under legal scrutiny and with genuine accountability for the things that legal scrutiny revealed. There were days when the weight of it was visible on Adrian in ways he didn't try to hide from her anymore. There were conversations with his legal team and Marcia's office and federal oversight that went badly, and then better, and then badly again before they went right. She was present for some of it. Not all her work for Marcia's office had its own demands, its own complicated cases, its own version of finding what was actually there instead of what was supposed to be. But she was there for the hard nights and the early mornings, and the moments when he put something down that he'd been carrying and looked lighter and more tired simultaneously, the way you do when a burden you've carried long enough has become load-bearing. 6 months after the restructuring was complete, after the criminal elements had been dissolved, and the legitimate operations had been restructured, and the legal accountability had been met in the specific documented unglamorous way that real accountability actually works. Sophia walked into a coffee shop near Marsh's office on a Wednesday morning and saw a woman at a corner table with two teenagers. The woman was Diane Caruso. Diane saw her at the same moment. Their eyes met across the coffee shop. Diane's expression moved through several things quickly and arrived somewhere that Sophia could only describe as recognition, not just of Sophia's face, but of what Sophia represented and what that meant. She stood up. She walked across the coffee shop. She stopped in front of Sophia. "I never said thank you," Diane said. "You don't have to," Sophia said. "I do." Her voice was steady. She'd had months to arrive at this steadiness, and it was real, the kind that comes from processing something completely rather than burying it. "You didn't know me. You had no obligation to protect me. The job didn't require it." She held Sophia's gaze. "And you did it anyway." Sophia thought about a woman in a hospital corridor holding a business card. A woman who had done what frightened mothers do, survived, and who was standing here now in a coffee shop with her teenagers doing homework at a corner table, steady and free. "Someone else made that decision before I did," Sophia said. Diane nodded slowly. She understood who Sophia meant. "I know," she said. "I know that." A pause. "Is he?" "He's well," Sophia said. "He's working." Diane nodded again. She looked like she wanted to say more and was deciding whether it needed to be said. Then she simply nodded once more in the way of a person who has reached the end of a chapter rather than a conversation, and went back to her children. Sophia got her coffee and walked to Marsh's office, thinking about the specific texture of that nod. The end of a chapter. The way something that had been a crisis became a fact of life, became a thing. You could sit in a coffee shop having done your homework from. That was what survived, she thought. Not the dramatic moments. Not the confrontations and the turning points and the documented revelations. Those mattered, and they were real, but they weren't what lasted. What lasted was the ordinary. Tuesday the coffee, the teenagers, doing homework, the nod that said, "I know what happened, and I am here, and I am still myself." That was what it meant when something healed. She thought about that all day. That evening, Adrian was waiting at the apartment when she got back. He had cooked badly with the specific, earnest incompetence of a man who had spent 40 years having other people cook, and was in the process of learning to do it himself, which she found both useful and endearing. He told her the pasta was overcooked. She told him it was fine. It was not fine technically, but it was real, which was better. They ate. They talked about their respective days with the ease of two people who had been doing this long enough that the ease was genuine rather than achieved. He told her about a conversation with his restructured board of directors. She told him about a case Marsh had assigned her that had the preliminary characteristics of something significant. She told him about Diane Caruso. How was quiet when she finished. She could see him placing it, Diane in a coffee shop, steady, living her ordinary life. The nod. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her across the table. The man who had sat alone in a dark office holding a photograph, grieving a sister who had been gone for 19 years while the world built stories about what he was. The man who had let an investigative accountant walk away because she'd said something true. The man who had spent 14 months building a case against himself because accountability was not optional if it was going to mean anything at all. "Do you still think everyone sees you as a monster?" she asked. The question came out quietly, with the weight of having been building toward this for months, since the first night in the dark office when it had been his question and her answer, and neither of them had known what was coming. He looked at her. "Some people always will," he said. He held her gaze. "But I no longer need to prove them wrong." The apartment was quiet. The city outside was doing what cities did, relentless and indifferent, and completely unaware that inside one apartment, a man who had spent 20 years being one thing had become, through work and honesty, and the specific difficulty of choosing differently when the old way was easier, something closer to what he'd been before the world had required him to be anything else. Sophia reached across the table. He took her hand. And the greatest victory, the one that didn't make headlines, that wasn't in any case file, that couldn't be documented or subpoenaed or entered into evidence, was simply this: A man who had once asked whether he was a monster, sitting across from a woman who had answered honestly.